Well, my guest today is Shane or Rourke, and this week we're going to discuss some fascinating part of Russian and also Ukrainian history, which is the Cossacks. And of course, as always, I ask the historian, how did you get involved in studying the Cossacks?
When I was doing my MA, I did an MA on the Russian Revolution and Civil War, and I had to pick a subject for a dissertation. So at the time when I was looking for a subject, I happened to be reading Mikhail Sholokov's novel about the Cossacks during the Civil War, Tiki Don. In English, it's translated as Quiet Flows the Don. And this was an account of the Cossacks just before the First World War, down to the end of the Civil War. And it was that decided me to write about the Cossacks during the Civil War. So that's how I became interested in them. It was a long time ago. As I say, it was when I was doing my MA in the 1980s. And I stuck with them for many years after that. I then went on to write my doctorate at Oxford on the Cossacks. I published a couple of books on them and several articles. I'm now working on other things, but it's still a big interest for me, and I always remain fascinated by them.
But do we not have an idea where the Cossacks came from? Where they are they kind of where did they emigrate from, and where did they choose to stay in what area of Europe are they?
Yeah, this is one of the big I suppose, debates in Cossack history. Where do they come from? Because if we start with their name, for instance, Cossack, it's just a translation of the word used in Russian for them, which is Kazakh. But that word isn't a Russian word. It's not Slavic. It's actually Turkish in origin. And that gives us a clue to their identity, to where they actually came from, because Kazaki existed, I suppose, in the Middle Ages, you could say, in the Great Steppe. The steppe is this grasslands that stretches from the Hungarian plain in the west to the Great Wall of China in the east, more or less. It's an enormous flatlands, grasslands. And over the centuries, nomadic peoples have crossed the steppe from east to west and from west to east. I mean, if you think of all the great invasions in European history, from the Huns, the Avars, the Mongols, Magyars, all of these people have moved across the steppe westwards, through what is today Russia and sometimes deep into Europe. The Mongols actually reached as far as Hungary before they decided to turn back in the 12th century? No, 13th century, sorry. Yeah. The Kazaki comes from this steppe society, from the nomadic peoples of the steppe. What they were essentially... They
weren't like other Slavic people, were they?
Not in the beginning, they weren't. They were Turkish people. They were nomadic peoples. And what was different about them was that they were essentially mercenaries. They were men who basically didn't want to accept, the normal nomadic way of life. They preferred to live as soldiers, selling their services to whoever could pay for them. So that was what the original Kazaki were. They were Turkish nomads, or Turkic nomads, perhaps I should be more specific. And they were basically a form of mercenaries. Timur, the great conqueror, Tamerlane, as he's better known in English, began his life as one of these members of one of these Cossack bands, basically Kazaki. And he rose, obviously, to be a figure of world significance. So these were an essential part of steppe life, these Kazaki, these soldiers of fortune. And as particularly as the Mongols moved west, as you know, they conquered Russia in or the land that we now think of as Russia in the 13th century. They set up a state in the steppe, the Kipchak Khanate, It's sometimes called the Golden Horde. And the Kazaki sort of appeared with them as well. And what they did essentially was they carried on offering their services to whoever paid for them. So sometimes it was the Kipchak Khanate, sometimes it was Muscovy, sometimes it was even the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. They weren't fussy about who they fought for as long as they were paid. And
that was a mercenary life in general, though, as whoever paid highest, and where they would go with them.
Yes. So that, I mean, they weren't fussy, and if it meant fighting, against other Turkic peoples, didn't matter. I mean, it was just a job. So that's where the original Kazaki came from. And what starts to happen with the sort of Slavic peoples of the steppe is that gradually they start to move southwards into the steppe, that they begin to come into contact with these bands, these Kazaki, and some of them join them. They become, they adopt that way of life, hiring themselves out, joining up with other bands that exist in the steppe. You can imagine that these people are very, they're not ordinary people. There's something different about them. They want a life of excitement, of adventure. They don't want to sit on a farm, making a living that way. They want something different. So they move from the borders of Muscovy and from, say, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth.
They had no desire in forming their own empire, having a capital, that sort of thing.
They what? Sorry, could you repeat that?
They didn't have any desire in forming their own empire or having their capital, or kind of like some others, rest of the civilized Western world. But
they didn't. What they did was they went into the steppe lands, this sort of empty zone, and decided to make their living there. I mean, they became very good horsemen. They were like the steppe nomads. They were extremely skillful cavalry. They lived, they were tough, they were resourceful, they were well able to look after themselves. And basically they lived in small groups, attached themselves to small groups, and lived by banditry, by sometimes hunting and fishing they could sell, or sometimes hiring themselves out. Over time, in the sort of area, the two great centers of Cossack settlement, which were on the River Don in, who would go on to become the Russian Cossacks, and on the River Dnieper, the Zaparojan Cossacks, the ones go on to become the Ukrainian Cossacks. They're the two original Cossack settlements as we know them. But as I say, they didn't aspire to, be an empire. What they wanted was to live a Cossack life, serving whoever paid them.
Were they more as gypsies in a way?
Well, you can think of them as nomads in a sense, a nomadic, that they followed the nomadic lifestyle. Originally, they didn't have women in their settlements. They didn't want any women there. It was to be a completely male community, a warrior community, a band of brothers. That's how they lived on their settlements in the Don and on the Dnieper. Over time, by the 16th century, you start to get beginnings of an organized political community on both the Don and the Dnieper. That the Cossacks, they had an assembly which decided all their great matters. They elected a leader, an ataman on the Don, or a hetman in Ukraine on the Dnieper. So they had a structure in place by the mid-16th century. There was a sort of organized community there. And they decided the policy of each Cossack army or host, as it was known.
So where do we get the sources, especially of the earlier history? Because the way it sounds to me, it doesn't sound like they were quite literate. But the history is orally, or is it? So how much do we have to take kind of with a grain of salt, or especially early history from the Cossacks, or does it mostly come from Western sources?
They appear in both Russian or Ukrainian, Polish sources and Western sources as well. Travelers there mention them. They appear in the Russian chronicles first in I think the first mention of them is in 1444, when the Chronicle just reports that they were part of the army of a Russian prince, the Prince of Ryazan, which was a frontier town at that point, who were pursuing some Tartar bandits into the steppe. So that's the first earliest mention that we have of them. But they appear fairly frequently in the chronicles after that. You know, and as I say, European travelers write about them quite a bit as well. They mention them quite often. So, you know, although we don't have an enormous amount of material about them, there is quite a substantial amount, and enough to make sort of some conclusions about their origins, the development of their community, and their beliefs.
But there's nothing like internal sources from.
Very few, actually. They do start to emerge, but it's at a later period. I think it's probably towards, you know, it must be in the 18th century that, you know, that they start to write, you know, produce information about themselves. But because, as you say, for a long period, you're dealing with an illiterate community by and large, that when they need to communicate with the surrounding states, they had scribes who would write letters for them. They would, you know, send requests, give answers to diplomatic missions, and so on. But in the sense that people there actually wrote about their own lives, that doesn't start appearing until the 18th century, I would think, at the earliest.
How did the Western world and Western / Russian world view the Cossacks? Did they view them as barbarians, or did they just view them as kind of a useful necessity?
Yeah, the image varied. Quite often they were the embodiment of Russian savagery, of barbarism. They were seen as, you know, when the Russian armies advanced into Europe, like in the 7 Years' War, for instance, you know, the Cossacks became famous for their how much they looted, how much they robbed. I mean, all soldiers at the time robbed and looted, but apparently the Cossacks were particularly noted for it. You know, so on the one hand, they were seen as this barbarian force. On the other hand, they were often portrayed as noble savages as well, these sort of heroic fighters. It largely depended on the state of relations with Russia at the time. So during the Napoleonic Wars, to the British, they appeared as these great sort of heroes chasing Napoleon back across Europe. To the French, of course, they were barbarians, and they were a figure of terror because, as I said, during Napoleon's retreat from Moscow, Cossacks, you know, were part of the forces that continually harassed the Grand Armée as it retreated. So, as I say, they moved between these two visions of the Cossacks as, you know, as terrible savages, or as, you know, a romanticized view of them as these free, as the noble savage, I suppose. So it depended very much on the state of affairs between Russia and whichever country was writing about them.
Do we have an idea what the Cossack camp should look like? Was it like a tent, or was it like a little tree house? Not tree house, but a little house, kind of. I think kind of more or less Mongolian kind of house.
Well, the original ones, as far as we can tell, what there was a stockade, a few huts in which everybody slept, and that was about it, really. It wasn't terribly sophisticated. I can't imagine it being very comfortable. But the host, the Cossacks, wouldn't stay there the entire year. They would, when they were on campaign, when they were at war with somebody, obviously they dispersed, they weren't there. They would come together once or twice a year to sort of sort out the great problems of the host, to elect leaders. So they didn't need a particularly sort of sophisticated urban center for what they did. And in Ukraine, the Zaparojan Cossacks, their main headquarters was an island in the middle of the river, and it was surrounded by rapids and whirlpools that made access to it extremely difficult. You couldn't do it by boat. You had to get out of a boat and thread your way on foot through the rapids, which was very dangerous. So it made it very easy to defend. On the Don, there were several centers, but eventually they settled in Cherkask, in the lower Don, which was, again, very far. It was hard to get for people who didn't know the place. It was easy to defend. So they became the sort of two centers of Cossack power. But again, they weren't particularly sophisticated cities. They were fairly rough and ready.
So what kind of weapon were the preferred use for a Cossack?
Cossacks, obviously they were very skilled on a horse. They were like the steppe nomads. They were brilliant horsemen. They used swords, lances. They also adapted very well to gunpowder, the gunpowder revolution. They were very resourceful. When we look at accounts of foreign mercenaries who were in the service of Muscovy, they always wrote quite highly about the Cossacks, saying they were much better than the Muscovite troops. They were more daring, more aggressive. They had far more initiative. So they used these weapons, all sorts of weapons, including the most modern as well as the traditional ones of the steppe nomads.
So they adapted easily. So.
Yes, very easily. If you see pictures of them, they tend to look like Turks or Turkish nomads. There's a great painting of Ilya Ryepin, of the Cossacks writing an insulting letter to the Turkish Sultan. And if you look at the clothes that they're wearing, their hairstyles, all of them are the hairstyles of steppe nomads. Ryepin was writing, or drew his picture, in the 19th century, but it was based on historical descriptions of Cossacks of an earlier period. So you can see again the Turkish influence on them in their weapons and in their clothes, even in their hairstyles. They adopted hairstyles of the Turkish nomads.
Was there a sort of hierarchy in the Cossack rank, or I assume they must have some form of leadership? And how would you go on about becoming a leader of the Cossacks? And we will take a look at the Cossack revolt later, but of course, I assume there must have been some kind of leadership in the Cossacks.
Yes, there was actually, and in the original Cossacks, the leadership was elected every year when they met in either Cherkask or on the Zaparojan Sich.
So it was more or less a democracy in a sense?
It was a system of anarchic democracy. Everybody had a vote. Everybody could choose, or had a say in who was to be ataman, leader of the Cossacks. And originally, basically, they chose people on the basis of their war experience, their reputation among other Cossacks, and it was a very open system. Over time, that began to change, and you start to see a group of men or emerging who begin to dominate the lives of the Cossack hosts, and they begin gradually from the 17th, 18th century to monopolize the leading positions in the host, and the democratic element of the Cossacks begins to fall away at the assembly. But it takes a long time, and it's quite a violent process as well.
How violent did it get? Like what kind of violence are we talking about here?
Well, if you as an elite begins to emerge within the Cossack community, it creates all sorts of tensions, because the rank and file Cossacks, the ordinary ones, are still committed to the sort of democratic and egalitarian ideals of the original Cossacks, i.e. that we share everything together, and we elect leaders based on their ability. So when you start to get a system where an elite begins to take on permanent form. They begin to pass on their privileges to their children. And also they begin to live substantially better than other members of the host. Then that creates enormous tensions. And
is this inspired by the Western world that is trying to think, hey, maybe we should adapt to this and we should try to have a nobility of our own, sort of?
Well, that's essentially what happens with the elite's leadership. They're looking for nobility. They're looking to be able to dominate and exploit the rest of the Cossacks. That happens both in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, to whom the Cossacks nominally owe obedience or allegiance, and also in the in Muscovy, when the Don Cossacks swear allegiance to the Tsar.
Again, which we'll come back to talk more in detail later.
So, sorry, then tell me your question again. Sorry.
Did they take the nobility from the Western world, that their nobility strength was inspired from them, in a sense?
I think it was just inspired.
Or did it evolve naturally?
No, I mean, the model they had was of the surrounding societies. Obviously, the elite would look at the way the Polish gentry behaved, and the Muscovite gentry as well. They dominated their peasants. They had wealth, they had status, and they had power. And I suppose they gradually began to feel that they should have this too, that they should be in a similar position, rather than simply, a Cossack who was leader for a year and then went back to being an ordinary Cossack as it had been in the beginning. So, I mean, the model of the societies around them were very hierarchical and status obsessed. So it's not surprising that as soon as an elite begins to emerge, they begin to see themselves in the terms of the elites of either Muscovy or of Poland, which is the nobility.
Was this more or less accepted by the other Cossacks? Or they did like, we're not okay with this. We want to go back to the old ways.
There were many revolts in the Cossacks, both in Ukraine and in Russia, during the time of troubles.
We're not talking about the Irish troubles, the Russian troubles.
No, this is in Russia at the beginning of the 17th century. The old dynasty collapsed, and then for about 12 years, 14 years.
Of course, after Ivan the Terrible.
Yes.
Until the first Romanov.
Yeah, till the election of Mikhail Romanov in 1613. Well, the country was plagued by civil war, revolt, unrest, foreign invasion, and the Cossacks played a big part in that. They backed the first false Dmitri. They also took part in the revolts led by a slave, Ivan Bolotnikov. And then later on in the 17th century, the great Cossack hero Stepan Razin, he exploited the tensions within the host.
He almost got to the capital too, didn't he?
He did, actually. He led a huge revolt. He sailed up the Volga, calling on peasants to rise up in support of him, which they did. He was a real threat to the regime before he was finally defeated. But he was able to use the tensions in the host between, the poor Cossacks, who were his main support, and the rich Cossacks who bitterly opposed him because they thought he was a threat to them. He came from the elite Cossacks, but for his own reasons, he decided to put himself forward as the leader of the poor Cossacks. And then I suppose the biggest revolt of all came in the 18th century during the reign of Catherine the Great, when Emelian Pugachev, who was a Don Cossack, he led the Cossacks of the Terek River, the Yak, as it was known earlier, against Catherine the Great. He claimed to be the murdered husband of Catherine the Third.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about that now, because they do split in groups, don't they, eventually? Like you said, the Don Cossacks and the Ukrainian Cossacks. When did this happen? When did they split into these three groups?
I think they arose independently on the steppe lands. They were never unified as one whole Cossack nation stretching from the river Dnieper in the west into Siberia in the east, because several of them the Don and the Zaparojan Cossacks arose more or less at the same time. And then these Cossacks set up other settlements in other places in the river Yak, in what's today the Ural Mountains. There were Cossack communities set up on the Terek River in the Caucasus as well. So there was never a unified Cossack sort of political structure.
So how come we cannot call them Ukrainian Cossacks and then the Don Cossacks and then just Cossacks in a sense?
Sorry,
when did the name kind of develop, that the Ukrainian Cossacks? When did we kind of I don't remember the word to use here, but when did we classify them into Ukrainian Cossacks and Don Cossacks?
They took those names themselves, especially the Zaparojan Cossacks, the ones who become Ukrainian Cossacks. They call themselves, Zaparojan Cossacks. The Don Cossacks call themselves Don Cossacks, and those from the Terek, call themselves Terek. They often take the name from the river. Later on, they become identified with either Russia or Ukraine, depending on which, where they originated from. So originally, I mean, the most important thing about them was that they were Cossacks. Actually, that was the important part of their identity. And then the name of the particular host that they came from.
So you mentioned this earlier, but let's talk a little bit more about the Sten-Karasin revolt. What was the Sten-Karasin revolt, and what was the reason for the revolt in the first place?
Well, the revolt seems, had many reasons. Firstly, Razin was a very turbulent figure. He was a charismatic leader. He'd been a successful war leader. He'd led raids against the Persian Empire, very successful plundering expeditions there. He'd fought in wars on behalf of Muscovy. And for whatever reason, he decided that, he preferred the company of the poor Cossacks, these very turbulent people, rather than the elite Cossacks. And he, as I say, he was able to use the tensions within the host, but also tensions within Muscovite society as well. That's when he decided to begin his revolt. He could he wanted to use the anger of the peasants as well, who were experiencing serfdom in a very harsh form in the 17th century. He was also able to draw on some of the peoples who had been conquered recently by the Muscovite state, some of the sort of nomadic peoples as well, Turkic peoples, who'd started to come under Russian domination at that point. So he was able to unify under his banner sort of peasant unrest, people angry at Russian domination, imperial domination, and the Cossacks themselves. Also, quite often in the cities, whenever a Cossack army approached, the poor in the cities would try to open the gates for him to protect or to bring him into the city, because they supported Razin as well. So there was a wide sort of constituency for him to draw upon in when he started his great revolt.
How close was it to succeed actually getting power?
He sailed up the Volga, and I think he got as far as Saratov on the Volga before he was finally stopped. His idea seems to have been to sail up the Volga as far as you can, as close to Moscow as possible, and then possibly move inland towards Moscow after that. But as I say, he was stopped and he was forced to retreat. He was then seized by the Cossack host, the leaders of the Cossacks on the Don, who handed him over to the Muscovites, and he was executed in Red Square. He was quartered there, and but to say, he became one of the great folk heroes of Russian history.
So I believe this is, I might be wrong here, but I believe it was the Ukrainian people who finally decided that they needed a protectorate. And why did they think they needed a protectorate and in the first place?
Well, the Ukrainian Cossacks had originally sworn allegiance to the Polish king. Although they didn't always obey him, in fact, they frequently disobeyed him. Nevertheless, they were subjects of the Polish king. But what happened in the 17th century was that the Polish state became more oppressive. It began to crack down on the Cossacks, try to control them more carefully, to curb their turbulence, their unrest, because they frequently engaged in revolts against the Polish state when they didn't get what they wanted. At the same time, in Ukraine, you have like in Muscovy, you have an enserfed peasantry who are Orthodox by religion, but their masters are Polish and they're Catholic. So you have a lot of discontent there. A peasant, peasants very unhappy. At the same time, the Cossacks are being oppressed. And the Polish government at this point as well is trying to persecute the Orthodox faith. It's trying to convince the population to become Catholic. So all these things are coming together. And what brings them together in a massive revolt in 1647 is a Cossack called Bogdan Khmelnytsky. He's a relatively wealthy Cossack. He's loyal to the Polish crown, but he's attacked by a Polish noble. His family is destroyed, and as a result of that, he leads this great revolt of the Cossacks against the Polish crown.
Yeah, but I sent you a mail about this earlier, and but this was the one that I was referring to.
Yeah. Okay, but what he then, as I say, he defeats the Poles in battles, and he sets up the Ukrainian Cossack state. But he knows he needs protection. It's a dangerous world, that the Cossack state is unstable, it's new, and he wants to ensure its survival. So he begins to look around for a protector. And originally, he's thinking of either the Crimean Khanate, which is in the south, obviously, where Crimea is today, which is a sort of semi-nomadic state, or even the Ottoman Empire. He would have quite liked the Ottoman Empire because, one, it was powerful, but also it's quite far away, so it actually makes it less of a threat. But in the end, he opted for Moscow, for the protection of Moscow, so that they would protect the Ukrainian state, the Hetmanate. In return, he swore allegiance to Moscow in return for Moscow guaranteeing the privileges and autonomy of the Ukrainian Cossacks, of their state.
And of course, I have to ask, with the current Ukrainian invasion or special military operation, as Putin calls it, is this treaty we are talking about what he kind of refers to justify his invasion of Ukraine?
It's part of it. I mean, the main justification for it is that Ukraine was once part of the lands of Kiev and Rus, the great medieval state of the East Slavs. That state covered the territory of what is now Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. And so Putin, as far as I understand it, he seems to think that it's his mission to recreate the territory of Kiev and Rus, to reunite it, and to make it once again part of Russia, the Russian state. And again, they also do use Russian history to justify this. They will talk about Bohdan Khmelnytsky as a person who brought Ukraine back, or was part of the process of bringing Ukraine back into the Russian lands, although that clearly wasn't his intention. He wanted an independent state, and he only turned to Muscovy because it seemed the best of, or the least worst choice that he had at that point. So that forms part of it. The other thing that Putin uses. I mean, in Russian history, the great villain is another Ukrainian Cossack called Ivan Mazepa. Mazepa changes sides when the Swedes are fighting Peter the Great. He joins the Swedes, and of course, he's trying to protect the autonomy of the Cossack state. But he becomes a great villain of Russian history, although he's a national hero in Ukraine today, so seen as a great nationalist, tragic figure. But he's a hero.
I mean, I think Putin's reason for recreating this greater part is kind of ridiculous, because it's like saying that Italy has the right to recreate the Roman Empire because it's not initially or was originally Roman. Half of Europe were basically Romans, and that should be their reasoning for recreating the Roman Empire. It's shady, if you ask me.
Well, it is ludicrous. It's as if President Macron one morning woke up and remembered that, Germany, Holland, Belgium had all been part of the Empire of Charlemagne.
Yeah.
Decided that he must, it was his duty to recreate it. It's a nonsense. I mean, what happened 1,000 years ago shouldn't have a determining influence on what happens today,
Exactly.
So, yes, as I agree with you, it is a nonsense. It's preposterous.
I mean, I would be all for recreating the Roman Empire, but I mean, come on.
Yeah, yes, I know. It's, and the problem is, of course, Ukrainians, whether they're Russian speaking or Ukrainian speaking, first and foremost, the vast majority have rejected the war, Putin's claims to them. And that's why it's so difficult, but the Russians are finding it so difficult in Ukraine at the moment, is because the population as a whole reject Putin's claims over them. Yeah.
And of course, we have to talk about what was it like for the Cossacks in Ukraine under, we don't back in time, not in the current, but when they've signed the Treaty of Moscow. I don't try to, you said this before we started recording, I'm going to try to say it right. The Pereyaslav Treaty. Yeah. What was it like under Russian influence for the Cossacks and the Ukrainian people?
What the Cossacks wanted was to create, say, their own independent state in which they would, they acknowledged the authority of Moscow, but lived according to their own rules, and and were free to organize their lives. What you have in the next 100 years is the continual pressure on them by, first of all, the Muscovite state, and then when it becomes the empire during the reign of Peter the Great, of Imperial Russia. And as I say, there's this relentless pressure in which the promises made to the Cossacks in the Treaty of Pereyaslav are gradually whittled away. It becomes more and more under the control of Russia, and eventually Catherine the Great finally abolishes the state. She even destroys the Cossack settlement on the in the river, in the Dnieper, the original settlement of the Zaparojan Cossacks. She destroys that, and the Cossacks then are deported to southern Russia, to an area called the Kuban in southern Russia, and they form what eventually becomes the Kuban Cossacks. But that's a bit later on.
I want to skip towards a few bits here because we might be skipping a few years again, but of course the 20th century coming on and World War I is of course affecting the Cossacks as well. So what was it like for the Cossacks, and whose side did they side with Russia in the World War I, and how significant were they part in the Russian army and under World War I?
Well, they become, what we see with the Cossacks is that gradually they're brought more and more under the control of the imperial state, that after Pugachev in the 1770s, after his great revolt, there are no more Cossack revolts, and nothing like what we'd seen earlier. So, they become integrated into the Russian army, although they serve as separate units. They serve under peculiar conditions. They exist as a sort of, as a cavalry force. Again, the state wants to make use of their abilities on a horse. So that's what their role is during the various wars of Russia in the 17th the 18th and the 19th and even the 20th century.
How are the Cossacks viewed at this time? By that I said earlier, we talked about if they were more or less barbarians in the earlier years, but does the view of the Cossacks develop under, and are they looked at as an ethnicity, or are they more or less?
Well, in Europe, they're still viewed pretty much as savages, as barbarians, but within Russia, they begin to be viewed in terms of a people who had always been loyal to the state, who served the empire, who fought heroically in all the empire's wars. So the state, of course, paid no attention to all the great Cossack rebels. You know, it ignored them completely because that didn't fit the myth of the Cossack service to the state. So in the sort of 19th and 20th century, you get this sort of version of Cossack history promoted in which they've always been loyal servants of the Russian Empire and the Tsars. And as I say, that's the version of history that that this imperial state wants to create and pushes very hard, you know, down to its destruction in 1917.
I mean, I different I don't remember if you mentioned this, but are they more or less nomadic now, or are they starting to civilize, live in normal homes? Or
yeah, what happens in the 18th century, they begin a process of moving from a nomadic warrior lifestyle to a more settled agricultural one. They begin to settle the land of the Don territory. It's very fertile. It's a lot of it is Black Earth region, that very fertile part, mostly Ukraine, but part of it in the Don as well. So it becomes, they begin to live a more settled life. They live in villages, small towns, and they farm. But at the same time, they still provide a very peculiar military service to the Russian state. It's sort of separate service that they're different from. They're not seen as peasants. They've never been serfs. So they're seen as free men, but they, as I say, they provide a military service for the Tsars. They have to pay for their own horse, their uniform, and I think cold weapons, swords, pikes, lances. But the state provides firearms. The state took on, so they didn't have to provide their own rifle, but everything else they had to provide.
it is fascinating how they don't really change over the span of a century and the 1,000 years, that they still are a warrior tribe, even in the 19th, 20th century, that still stay on to the tradition that they had over 1,000 years ago from first they started appearing.
It's probably about 500 years, but they do change. They do have a sense of themselves as a distinct people, as a distinct group. And there's this big argument: what exactly were they? Were they just simply a group created by the Russian state to serve its needs? Or were they an ethnic group? Were they a nation? Or were they something in between? Is it hard? It's quite hard to find a category to describe them, because they have elements of all these different groups in them. So it's not easy to categorize what they were. I think that they were a separate group, that they were on their way to becoming a different ethnic group, if you like. If the Civil War had gone on, if they'd been on the winning side in the Civil War, in terms of it's quite possible you would have seen a Cossack nation emerge on the Don and the Kuban rivers. It might not have happened, but to me, it seems quite clear that their identity is a very complicated issue. Nobody in Russia today, they call the Cossacks a sub-ethnos of the Russian people, which, you have to work out, well, what does that mean? In my understanding, what it means is, I think that they were beginning to they were separate from the normal or from usual Russian people, the Russian ethnic identity, that they had a separate identity that, which is why they use but one that was in some ways closely attached to Russia.
I mean, you said that they were dissolved after the Russian Civil War, but you do still see a Russian friend of mine. I was talking with him, and he did send me photos of of Cossacks, sorry, in the Red Army, and
Yeah.
they did serve in the World War II, so they were completely demolished, were they?
No, they weren't. I mean, many of them fought in the Red Army during the Second World War. As some fought for the Germans as well. It was their chance to get revenge on the Soviet regime. They suffered greatly during the Civil War. There was, they were the main enemies of the Bolsheviks, their most dangerous enemies, and many tens of thousands were killed during the Civil War. They also suffered during collectivization under Stalin. When Stalin collectivized all the land in the Don, or in the Soviet Union, sorry, the Cossacks suffered very badly with that. Again, I think that their communities were actually really, as communities that were capable of reproducing themselves, vanished after the Second World War. Really, that their whole way of life was destroyed. The communities were scattered. They were killed. They were scattered. And although the memory,
Of course, I assume gulags was someone
sorry,
ended up. I assume someone ended up in the gulag as well.
an
I
awful
assume.
lot, yes, would have been a lot would have been executed during the terror, arrested, sent to the gulag, or shot, or simply just shot. So that there was I think as a community, as I said, that was capable of reproducing itself from generation to generation, that really had ended by the end of the Second World War. You start to get, new people moving into the Cossack, had been the Cossack territories, and so gradually their identity, it's not lost completely, but as a distinct community, I think it is lost by the end of the Second World War. And there are people today who say they're descendants of Cossacks and they call themselves Cossacks. But this, to me, seems largely a matter of that, simply they choose to call themselves that.
How are Russians viewing and Ukraine? You said that some of them are national heroes, some of the Cossacks you mentioned, but how are they viewed in Russian history and Ukrainian history today as a people?
Well, I think they view them quite differently. In Russia, they stress the service of the Cossacks to the empire, its role in the wars of the Russian Empire, particularly the Napoleonic Wars. They're seen as great sort of heroes of the empire, and that's the side that the Russians stress. They don't mention, or they don't stress the role of Pugachev or Razin in the as these great rebels, these leaders of the people against the state. That's all gone now in the new Russia. And instead they emphasize their service to the imperial state as these great patriots. In Ukraine, on the other hand, they choose to emphasize, the fact that the Ukrainian Cossacks, the Zaparojan Cossacks, never accepted the authority of outsiders, that they were always in revolt against the Poles, against the Muscovites, against the Turks. These sort of an indomitable people who refuse to accept alien rule. And, so that the Cossacks, that side of the Cossack identity is a central part of modern Ukrainian identity that, and clearly it plays very well today when they're, once again, the Ukrainian people are refusing to accept, rule from Moscow. So both Ukraine and Moscow remember the Cossacks, but they remember them in very different ways.
Those who actually do descend from Cossacks today, do they view them as national pride, that they're proud of their heritage?
Where in
in general, those who descend from Cossacks.
Yes, I think they are. People who claim to be Cossacks, do look back on, to their past as, as they're part of a glorious tradition that, however they want to remember it, they see themselves as, descended from these people, and it's not something to be ashamed of. In Soviet Russia, it was difficult because the Soviet state was always suspicious of the Cossacks, didn't like them. But in the present day Russia, people are proud. You can see Cossack, people, in military uniform, claiming to be Cossacks, on horses, using sword skills, all that sort of stuff. And so, yeah, it is a matter of pride today.
You mentioned that they were skeptics to the Soviet Union, to the Cossacks, but they do see Cossacks I think it's done Cossacks in the victory parade after World War II as well.
Yeah, I mean, loads of Cossacks fought in the Red Army as cavalry, actually, on the Eastern Front. Cavalry still had a role on the Eastern Front during the Second World War, but they also fought in tank regiments, and every other type of unit as well.
Thank you so much for coming. If you want to learn more about the Cossacks, you can read Shane and Rourke's books, which I highly recommend, and I know I will. It's on my list for sure. Where can people find your books if they do want to learn more about the Cossacks?
Basically, Amazon is probably the best place to look. The book is just called The Cossacks, and it's available on Amazon, or at least it was the last time I looked anyway. So it's a paperback, so it shouldn't be horrendously expensive.
Do you have anything else you want to promote on the social media where people might find you, and the links you want me to put in the description before we go?
I don't think so. No, that's enough. I work at the University of York in the Department of History there. I can be contacted easily enough through, you can find me on the university's website. So.
Thank you so much for coming. This has been Will That Age 12. My name is Erlend. We are available on Instagram and Will That Age 12. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts. Please like, share, and subscribe. And if you are listening to iTunes or Apple Podcasts, please consider writing us a review. That would help us out a lot. This has been Will That Age 12, and I'll see you next time.